Hey everyone, I'm Mike Settele, the founder of Settele Tutoring, and in this lesson I'm going to talk about the top 10 fake grammar rules that you should know for the SAT. What does it even mean for something to be a fake grammar rule? Well, basically the SAT knows what you don't know, and they're going to use that against you. There are a lot of grammar rules that we learn from our teachers, from our parents, from the internet that aren't real rules, or maybe they're more like stylistic rules, but not the set objective grammar rules that we're going to see on the SAT. And the SAT knows that you know these things, and they're going to design questions to take advantage of your lack of knowledge. These are basically the SAT's grammar traps. Sometimes it's also that you kind of half know a rule, a real rule that they're testing, but they're actually going to test the other half that you are not as confident in. So this is going to overlap a lot with my other lesson on the top 10 grammar rules to memorize for the SAT. I definitely recommend that you check that lesson out. It is in a playlist that is in the description, which also includes individualized lessons on each of the grammar rules that you could see on the SAT. Basically, that playlist and this lesson allow us to play both offense and defense on the grammar section. Offense is learning new things, memorizing the rules, knowing what's going to be on the test, and defense is knowing what the SAT is going to do to try to trick us with those rules. And if we know both sides, if we have a good offense and a good defense, we can guarantee that we get all of the grammar questions right, and locking down the grammar points is the best way to get a great score on the reading section. So let's take a look at the top 10 fake grammar rules, starting with number 10. You can't start a sentence with because. I definitely learned this at some point in school, but it is not a real thing. It is not a real thing on the SAT. It is not a real grammar rule in the English language. At some point, it must have been a style rule, but we write sentences that start with because all the time. Here is an example of one that you could see on the SAT. This is a question that I wrote, so no spoilers of actual practice test questions. Remember, as always, my channel, I'm never going to spoil questions from the practice test. They're all things that I've created just so we can make a point. And in this case, some of you might look at these answer choices and think about this rule. You can't start a sentence with because, so choice B must be wrong. But I don't think about any of that, and neither should you. Instead, when you look at choice B, you should notice that it includes a period. And what the SAT does test is punctuation and sentence structure. So we can analyze whether or not we have a run-on sentence, complete sentences, who knows what's going on. So I would be reading this sentence here, trying to figure out where I have sentences that begin and end. So looking at the beginning part, I definitely have a sentence. The castor bean plant is not eaten by birds. That is a complete sentence. Now looking ahead, I would say, do I have another sentence that's part of this whole thing? And I do. If I skip a little bit, the castor bean is unpalatable or even deadly to birds and animals that consume large quantities. That is a complete sentence that could stand on its own. And basically, because we have these two complete sentences, we need a punctuation mark that allows us to connect or separate two complete sentences. The only one available to us here is the period. So they're trying to trick us. They want us to pick choice C because they want us to just continue the thought. And it isn't unreasonable to say the castor bean plant is not eaten by birds because of toxins in its seeds. But because the sentence doesn't end there, we can't just skip over the punctuation mark. We need a period to prevent a run-on sentence. So if you're distracted by this fake grammar rule, you might not notice the real grammar rule that's going on underneath. So this is why it's important to know the traps. Let's go to number 9. Semicolons are for related sentences. Well, this is kind of true actually, but on the SAT, it couldn't matter less. The one thing you need to make sure you know for semicolons is that in order to use one, we need to have a complete sentence beforehand and a complete sentence afterward. It's basically another version of a period. This is going to be true in 98% of cases where we see a semicolon on the SAT. For the other 2%, I highly recommend that you watch my video specifically on semicolons. It's going to get into those little exceptions, but basically that's all that matters because that's the only objective thing that we can analyze about a semicolon. Whether or not something is a complete sentence or a fragment, that is an objective grammar truth. But whether or not those sentences are related, that is subjective. You might say that two sentences are related. I might say that they're not. But we can't analyze a question that has that kind of opinion-based rule there. So that shouldn't matter when you're analyzing the semicolon on the SAT. Stick to stuff that's concrete. For that matter, what's to say whether or not sentences are related? Honestly, whenever you write, one sentence should be related to the one that follows it. You're not going to have just random thoughts. So I know we all learned this, that semicolons are for related sentences, and yes, it is kind of true, but any good writer is always going to make sure that one sentence that follows another is related to what just came before it. That's how good writing works. You don't just say random ideas, you move through an argument or an idea in a very reasonable, flowing, logical way. So not really a rule worth thinking about for the SAT. Just remember sentence before, sentence after, and you'll be fine with semicolons. Number 8, shorter is better. Okay, so this actually used to be a rule that was on older versions of the SAT, and it was really, really helpful that if we had two choices and one of them was a little bit shorter, that was probably more likely to be correct. But that is no longer the case. Again, that's kind of a style rule, something more subjective, and so that has to do with how the sentence sounds. But now the SAT is only testing grammar rules that are concrete, where there's only one correct answer. Even if others might sound okay, there's only one that follows the rules of grammar. Here's a great example of this. Wagging his tail, the mailman greeted the friendly dog, right? That sounds fine, and it's definitely shorter than choice B, but it is incorrect because it makes it look like that the mailman is wagging his tail. Instead, we need to make sure that the friendly dog is the thing that's wagging its tail. This is basically a modifiers question. And again, I have a whole lesson dedicated to this rule. It's really great because this is one of those rules on the SAT where people think that it's about style. They think it's about what sounds best, what's shortest, but there could be cases where instead we have to go with longer answers because the rule forces us to. So in this case, the modifier wagging his tail, that is description. What is it a description of? What is wagging his tail? The friendly dog is. So we need to follow that comma with the friendly dog. Everything else, even if it sounds a little weird, doesn't really matter. We need that first part to be the dog, and that is why we end up picking the longer choice here instead of choice A, which, we know the mailman isn't wagging its tail, but technically it is grammatically incorrect, so we're not allowed to pick it. Let's move on to number 7. Commas are for pauses. We all learn this when we're kids because it is the easiest way of introducing young children to punctuation and grammar. But again, this is a very subjective rule because who's to say whether something is a pause or not, right? Are we just taking a breath? Are we pausing? What's going on? Basically, we're going to talk about more comma rules in this lesson, but generally speaking, on the SAT, anytime we think about a comma, there's going to be an objective grammar rule that forces us to put it there. It is not about how it sounds. It is not about a pause. So if you're going with this rule, this fake rule, you will occasionally fall for traps because you will hear a pause where there isn't one, or you will insert a pause because you want to. You just need to take a breath. So here's some examples where maybe the pause is even hard to hear. In the middle of the night, I woke up screaming. Is there a pause there? I don't know. I took a little bit of a pause, but it's hard to say. That's not really the reason that that comma needs to go there. It needs to go there because we have a descriptive clause at the beginning leading into the main sentence. So that is an objective rule. And yes, we do need a comma. Maybe you would have put one there kind of naturally, but we want to back that up with an actual rule. What about this sentence? I like movies, music, and television. In that case, I definitely don't think I'm pausing where those commas are, but we all know that they need to go there because this is a list, and so we use commas to separate items in a list. But that's not because they're pauses, that's because that's how we use commas in lists. So again, thinking about it as a pause, you're not really going to be able to tell whether or not you need commas in this situation. Here's another case where I think our instincts might be wrong if we're thinking about commas as pauses. I like watching movies with my friends and listening to music by myself. I definitely pause after the word friends. I take a little bit of a breath. It's a long sentence, but this is written correctly. You would not put a comma here. This is just a list of two things. And the and sometimes gets a comma, but not when it's just a list of two. It gets a comma when we're talking about two sentences or when we're just got, like in the sentence before, a list of three or more things. I go into all of this detail when I talk about conjunctions in that specific video lesson, so I definitely recommend that one as well. But these are cases where your instincts might tell you there's a pause or there isn't a pause, and the comma is not related to that pause. So we want to make sure we have real concrete rules. And that gets to number 6. Extra clauses get commas. Well, sometimes. This is a fake rule because it is not consistent in English, and this is where commas get really tricky. And ideally on the SAT, we won't have to worry about this as much because there'll be other answer choices that force us to think about the extra clauses and the commas last. So we want to just kind of not have to worry about commas until we absolutely have to. But here's that sentence I said before. In the middle of the night, I woke up screaming. Why do we put a comma there? Because we have an extra clause at the beginning leading into the main sentence. But if I switch it around, I woke up screaming in the middle of the night, now we don't need a comma anymore. Why? Well, because the extra clause in the middle of the night, that's a prepositional phrase. And when the prepositional phrase is following whatever it's prepositioning, then we just don't use commas. It's just a rule in English. We don't need it. It is definitely extra. I could just have this sentence say, I woke up screaming. But if we're going to add the prepositional phrase at the end, no comma. If we kind of move it around to the beginning, then we use a comma. So it's inconsistent. Let's look at two other examples. I yelled at the dog that had bitten the mailman. Notice, no comma. But if we switch the word that to which, I yelled at the dog, which had bitten the mailman, now we get a comma. There are reasons for this that have to do with whether or not the clause is like a required clause or not, but basically the simpler version is that the word that in English generally does not get any commas, whereas the word which generally does. And so if you're thinking about this rule 6 as like, okay, anytime I have an extra clause, I have to put a comma, you're going to get stuff wrong. Because on the first sentence there, I yelled at the dog that had bitten the mailman, we definitely have a descriptive extra clause. That had bitten the mailman is not necessary. We could just say, I yelled at the dog. But we don't put a comma just because that's kind of the way that the word that works. So again, this is very tricky, but it does get down to very specific rules that come up in lots of questions. So certainly if you're reviewing a practice test, I highly recommend that you use my videos because I will always talk about the specific comma rules that work in that situation, in that question. Let's talk about some more comma rules that could get us in trouble. This is a very common one in the SAT. Appositives need 2 commas. They're going to test this. They love this rule because this is one of those cases where you've memorized half of the rule correctly, but the other half incorrectly. So the correct part looks like this. We might have a sentence like, Moises St. Clair, the professional philosopher, described a new type of thought. This seems like a sentence that you could write. You know, we have the main person we're talking about, and then we have a little bit of a descriptive clause and appositive that's giving us more information about Moises St. Clair. Who is he? What's his deal? He's a professional philosopher. So we use 2 commas to separate that extra clause from the main sentence. But if we slightly reverse this appositive, the punctuation changes, and this is what the SAT is going to use against you. They're going to say something like this. Professional philosopher Moises St. Clair described a new type of thought. Notice that the meaning of the sentence has not changed at all. The only thing we did is we kind of switched around the 2 clauses, the 2 ways of describing Moises St. Clair. And when we put the title first and the name second, we generally do not use commas. The SAT knows that that second version is a little bit weird for you, and you really, really want to put 2 commas there. So they use this fake rule to kind of get you. So basically, I have a whole lesson about appositives that goes into the details here, and if you memorize that lesson, then you'll have both halves of the rule, and no matter which half they give you in a question, you will be ready. So I definitely recommend you watch that lesson. Another one that comes up is that you need a comma before a quotation. This is actually one of those things that everyone seems to believe. We are all taught this, but it's actually not true at all. And not only on the SAT, but not on the English language either. And it's certainly when you are writing term papers for college, it's really important to know this rule, that this rule is fake, I should say, because you will use quotations where you should not have any commas at all. Basically, it comes down to how we use the quotation within our writing. So this is the kind of a question or the kind of sentence that you would probably work on, that you would probably write. Something like Moises St. Clair said, this new type of thought has different properties that make the brain feel tingly and weird. That is correct. We would definitely need a comma there. This is kind of how we write in novels. We have a character said, a character declared, and then we do a comma, and then we put the quotation. But when you're writing things for essays in school and you're using a quotation, the better way to write is to fully integrate the quote into your own writing. So basically the other person's words and your words flow together in a way where there is no clear break, no word like said breaking it apart and separating them. So this would be a better way to write that same idea. Moises St. Clair described his new type of thought as having different properties that make the brain feel tingly and weird. Notice the only indication that we have switched from my voice to someone else's is the quotation marks, which is fine because if it's written down, that's a good enough clue to the reader that we have a now direct quotation. And so this is a case where we would not put a comma before that quotation because there is no interruption, there is no break. It's just a continuous thought, and we are using their words and our words kind of all in one flowing sentence. So the second one is definitely something to get used to for college. You will want to write that way, but the SAT is not really going to test this rule explicitly. What really happens with a rule like this is that there'll be a quotation kind of near the blank or in the blank, and they will make you think that they are testing this rule. But in fact, it'll be other comma rules, other punctuation rules that really matter. So basically, yes, you need to be aware of this, but basically mostly so that you can throw it aside and be like, okay, I know it's not about the commas and quotations. Most of the time, it's going to be about some other comma rule that matters more. So just don't think about this. It's kind of like the because at the beginning of this list, right? It's not really testing the SAT, but people think it is when they see it, and that gets kind of stuck in their head and forces them to ignore the real rules that the SAT is testing. So don't be distracted by commas and quotations in the SAT. Let's get to one that's not about punctuation at all. Number 3, I don't know where everyone learns this, but they think that the word they is for people and it is for objects. No, this is just so wrong. And so it really gets people kind of thrown off. The real difference between these rules has to do with singular and plural. The words they, their, and them are plural pronouns, whereas the words it and its, without an apostrophe, are singular pronouns, okay? And I don't know why everyone tells me that they is for people. This is something that pretty much like 75% of my students tell me when I ask them what the difference is between they and it. I don't know where it comes from because I know for a fact that all of you are using the word they to talk about objects pretty much every day of your life. Here's some examples, right? Where are my keys? They are on the table. Right? The keys are not people, right? That's not what we're talking about there. They're talking about the keys, right? So they is perfectly acceptable because there's multiple keys. Do you like tacos? Yes, I love them. Again, we're talking about tacos. We're not eating people, I would hope. We're talking about tacos. So we use the words they, their, and them all the time, literally every day, to talk about objects in plural form that are not people. So I don't know why this rule exists in people's brains, but it does. So hopefully if that's something you thought, now you don't. This is important for the SAT because they will occasionally test singular and plural pronouns, and it has nothing to do with whether we're talking about people or objects. It has everything to do with whether it's one thing or multiple things. Let's look at rule number 2, and this one is rough. However gets a semicolon and a comma. And what I mean by that is when we're using the word however within a sentence, what we usually like to do is have a semicolon kind of ending the first part, then we use the word however, then a comma, and then we continue with like another sentence. But that is not the only way that the word however gets punctuated. It could be the reverse, that we have a comma first, then the word however, then a semicolon, then we finish our thought. Or it could even be that there's no semicolon at all and we're using the word however with 2 commas, kind of inserting it into a sentence. And then very, very rarely, we don't even use any punctuation at all with the word however. But I'm not going to get into the details here. This is basically coming down to one of the hardest rules that you will see tested on the SAT. I call it the connector placement rule. And again, this is something that is in that playlist in the description. I highly recommend that you watch that video if you want a top grammar score. This is something that very often comes up in the hard reading module. If you need more practice with it, then definitely join my channel membership. I have a 10-question exercise that are all new questions, and I'm very proud of that. It will help you understand all the nuances of this rule. But for now, just think about it as that traditional punctuation that you associate with the word however is not the only way to do it. So you can't just pick that top however just because that's what you're used to. It really depends on the context and how the sentence is built. And that brings us to the number 1 fake grammar rule on the SAT, the one that gets people all the time. I see it with all my students. It's constant. The SAT loves to test it. Somehow we all learn colons are for lists. I don't know why everyone knows this information. Is it teachers teaching us? Is it some video that everyone's seeing about grammar? Is it a textbook that's out there? This is not a real thing. I cannot stress that enough. Basically, on the SAT, we have two things to think about. With a colon is a punctuation mark, and sometimes it is for lists. But on the SAT and in real life, most lists will not get colons, and most colons will not have lists. So this connection between colons and lists, just wipe it from your mind. It doesn't matter. That is not what we need to know. So what they're going to try to do, though, is take advantage of the fact that you somehow learned this fake rule, and they're going to give you situations like this. A good exercise regimen should include some cardio, such as jogging, swimming, or cycling. Now notice the colon after such as, that is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is the real rule to memorize for colons is that you need a sentence beforehand, then the colon basically acts like a period before we get into whatever the second part is. The second part could be another sentence, it could be a list, or it could be just one word. We have a lot of flexibility. So that first sentence is wrong because if we stopped reading at the colon, we would hear that we didn't complete our sentence. We would hear that we just kind of ended abruptly. A good exercise regimen should include some cardio, such as. Can't stop there. Doesn't make any sense, right? So the better way to do it, if we really wanted to use a colon here, personally, I would just drop it. I would use that exact same sentence as written and just drop the colon entirely. And that's probably how you write. Remember, you write lists all the time. How often do you use colons, though? Probably not at all. So we know how to write lists, but this rule somehow gets implanted in our brain. And when the SAT offers us the chance to use a colon, for some reason, a lot of people take that chance, but it doesn't apply in this case. Instead, what we would need to do is change the sentence so that we do have a complete sentence, like an independent clause before the list. So in this case, we could say a good exercise regimen should include some cardio, right? We could put a period there, but then we're going to use the colon to add on some examples of cardio, and in this case, jogging, swimming, or cycling. No such as necessary here. So this is something that could come up. They really love this rule, and I think they love it because, like I said at the beginning, they know that you have kind of learned these fake grammar rules throughout your life and that they're sitting in your brain. And so they're purposely giving us these situations where they know we have a weakness and they're trying to see if they can get us to make an error. So we've got to memorize the rules, but it also helps to think like we just did about the fake grammar rules that we've learned along the way and adjust those rules to either the real one or fill in any gaps and make sure we learn the other half. Like I said, you can learn this by going to the free playlist that is in my description. I've got rules, I've got videos about every rule, as well as a top 10 list for grammar rules to memorize if you just want the highlights. And if you're looking for more practice for grammar, join my channel membership. Members have access to playlists for each individual grammar rule, 10 questions each, new questions that I have written so that we don't spoil the practice test. Each one puts the question on the screen and then gives a very detailed explanation like I've been giving here. So I highly recommend that you check that out. Grammar, by the way, is the easiest way to guarantee points on your reading section. You want to lock in grammar because it's predictable. Not just the rules that they test, but the fake rules that they test are predictable. It is very likely that when you take your SAT, at least a few of those grammar rules that we just went over, those fake rules, are going to come up and you'll be like, I thought this was a thing before, but now I'm going to make sure I don't fall for that trap and I'm going to get those points. My channel that also has similar ideas for similar video lessons for lots of other topics in reading and in math. So you can play both offense and defense that way too, thinking about things to memorize as well as the traps to avoid. If this helped, please like and subscribe and check out my channel. SetteleTutoring.com is my website, and the YouTube channel has tons of videos, like I said. Just remember, when it comes to your scores, don't settle for less. Settele for more. Thanks for watching.